I'm Jo Tovey, and this is the Full Story Newsroom edition. Well, it's been less than 2 weeks since a Redbridge poll put One Nation's primary vote ahead of both the Labor government and the coalition opposition for the first time. It marked a new level of popularity for a party that has sat at the fringe of Australian politics for decades and sparked a flurry of questions about whether Pauline Hanson could actually become Prime Minister. Ahead of her first appearance at the National Press Club next week, another first, we're going to break down the changing way the major parties and the media are grappling with One Nation. Will all this newfound attention lead to more scrutiny? And does it even matter to their voters if One Nation policies don't always stack up? With me today is Mike Tisher.
Hey Jo, great to be back talking about One Nation once again.
And Patrick Keneally.
Thanks. You could just put me on a loop about One Nation, I think.
And joining us from Canberra this week, we have Chief Political Correspondent Dan Jervis-Barty. Hi, Dan.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on.
So a couple of polls now have put One Nation ahead of both Labor and the coalition on primaries. Is it credible, therefore, to say that they are in an election-winning position, Patrick?
This is a difficult one to answer because you don't want to rule them out initially. The polling has been incredibly strong for One Nation and it's moved very rapidly. But we do also need to put caveats on that. They'd have to win 74 seats to get a majority in the House of Representatives. That would require, finding 150 candidates around Australia, vetting them, funding them, getting the volunteers to hand out. Like, it is an absolute mountain to climb. And I don't think at this stage we should treat it as either a fait accompli or even as something which is likely at this stage. I think if you look back, you mentioned the polling, the Redbridge poll in particular, they did an MRP poll that looks at seat-by-seat results. In that poll, they found the most likely outcome would be, based on current polling, would be 76 seats for Labor, so still a Labor majority, but by just one seat. One Nation would be left with 53 seats, and the coalition around 12. So that's not a majority position. So talk of Pauline Hanson as Prime Minister is probably unlikely, but that doesn't mean that we're not in for like a very, very dramatic, massive changes. A moment of completely upending the table of Australian politics and turning things around. That's a credible possibility, but simply going from a Labor majority government with a healthy majority to a One Nation majority, that scenario seems unlikely. But it's not a binary choice here. There could be many, many different outcomes. We're still 2 years for an election. And I don't think we should be ruling it out entirely, but also we need to understand the kind of environment that's happening in.
Even if Labor had a slim majority or even governed in minority, but One Nation had replaced the coalition as the opposition and had a substantial representation in the Senate, making it much harder for Labor to pass legislation, that would be a huge upturning of the tables in itself, let alone them actually becoming the government. So all of this, it's way premature to talk about whether she should become the Prime Minister or not, but I do think it's very fair to examine One Nation as a potential party of government, given that polling position, and they have to be, they can't say they're not. She seems to have been hedging around that a bit because they don't like to be seen as, weirdly, as the potential government, because they have that kind of insurgent, anti-establishment focus that is so appealing to a lot of their voters. They want to upturn the whole thing, but when you're polling, when you're ahead in the polls, you kind of have to present yourself as an alternative government, even if the chances of it happening, as Patrick, there are lots of logistical hurdles before that could happen.
I think Pat touched on a critical point, the fact that we're 2 years away from an election. It's significant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it gives both of the parties time to develop a policy response to One Nation, also a messaging response. But also, and you speak to pollsters and people in political research who make this point, is what we're seeing right now in the polling numbers is a signal. It's a very loud signal about where the electorate is at, but it's not necessarily an intention of how they are going to vote. And look at what happened at the last federal election. If you look at the polling through December 2024, January and February of 2025, Peter Dutton was leading in the polls. And then the election campaign starts and it becomes a very different question for voters to try and answer, the question of not sort of how are we feeling, but who do we want to run the country? And I think that's a kind of silver lining that the major parties, certainly the government, are holding on to, is that when it becomes a question of who do you want to lead the country, it's going to be a very different discussion around Pauline Hanson than the one we're having at the moment.
On this question of how the major parties are dealing with that signal that you mentioned, though, it's clear that it is scaring them and changing their behaviour. Let's start by talking about the coalition, who are more than 10 points behind One Nation and who clearly face an existential kind of threat at the moment. This week we saw Tony Abbott back preference deals with the party, and on Thursday, frontbencher Tony Payson went further and suggested a non-compete deal, essentially. So One Nation and the coalition would agree not to run against each other, which was a pretty extraordinary comment to make. Is the strategy from some Liberals here, Dan, if you can't beat them, join them?
Well, I mean, it's remarkable. If we just take a step back, we're not having a discussion around should the Liberals move to the centre or appeal to Teal voters. It's basically how closely they should associate with One Nation. And we've seen the response from Angus Taylor sort of ruling out this idea of carving up seats that Tony Payson had suggested. But it's clear that that's the number one question for the Liberals at the moment, both from the way they talk about policy and the policies they adopt, is we want to send a message to our voters, because there's a clear belief that a large cohort of people that are voting One Nation have gone from the Liberal Party, is they are trying to, they see them as their people. They don't see them as One Nation voters. They see them as Liberals who are taking a bit of a sort of political holiday with another party. And I think that explains a lot of the approach that they're trying to take, certainly with Tony Abbott in talking about preference deals and so on. They're trying to tell voters and not alienate them for sort of flirting with One Nation, because they feel like they are Liberals at heart, and that's the strategy they see to win them back. But I think the fact that so much of this discussion is just how closely we want to associate with One Nation.
I don't know what you think about this, Dan, but it seems that preference swaps are one thing, or preferencing One Nation is one thing, but literally standing down for them in seats speaks of a complete weakness and lack of confidence in your own ability to win government, doesn't it?
Seems like running up the white flag, really, and just surrendering. It's interesting, I think, just Matt Canavan and the Nationals seem to have taken a slightly different approach to this, and perhaps it's the seats that One Nation would be polling at highest in would be often currently Nationals held seats. Maybe they see it as a different imperative to have to fight them in those seats, rather than dividing up the seats between them and not contesting.
And I think if you look at what happened in the South Australian election, where there was a discussion around preference swaps with the Liberals and One Nation. So the Liberals decided to preference One Nation ahead of Labor, but One Nation didn't reciprocate that. They were like, we don't need these guys. They ran open tickets. So I know that Cos Samaras, is the pollster from Redbridge, has been out today saying, in response to what Tony Payson said, is when you're polling 18%, which is what the Liberal Party is polling at, you don't make offers, you're begging.
Yeah. They're not in a strong bargaining position.
They're not in a position of strength. And I think the other thing with Tony Payson, he's probably got a bit of self-interest here in he would clearly be someone who'd be vulnerable to One Nation. So having One Nation stand aside would clearly be in his best interest.
It is pretty extraordinary, though, some of the rhetoric. Like, you do hear people, some within the Liberals, some within the sort of more like right-wing commentary space, talking about the coalition and One Nation as if they're sort of already in a coalition, like they are the right of politics that needs to stop Labor. They, the distinction between those three political parties and movements is sort of already being muddied and lost, which is a very dangerous thing, as you say, if you are the minority partner in a partnership like that.
There's been a lot of descriptions of them in some papers as One Nation as being part of the centre right, which is like, if that's where the centre is, we've really come further than we thought.
It is repeated. It was in the paper today again.
Yeah.
It was the two parties of the centre right.
Yeah.
Which should be noted as well. Of course, there are some Liberals who've really pushed back on this. Andrew McLaughlin, the moderate senator, James Patterson was also on radio today saying this was, kind of suggesting it was extraordinarily premature, saying he wasn't interested in dividing the spoils with another political party 2 years out from the election and hitching our wagon to a brand with all the risks that entails between now and then, which frankly is pretty common sense stuff, you would think.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the default answer when politicians are asked around preference deals is they say, look, that's a decision for party head office. Well, who's the president of the Liberal Party? It's Tony Abbott, and he's the one that said it quite makes sense for them to do it. So this discussion's not going to go away. And I think it is just a fascinating subplot to what's going on in politics at the moment.
The other thing about the federal election, you rightly said how far away it is, but there's also state elections in the two biggest states to come in the next year. And that will tell us a lot more about whether One Nation's polling translates into votes, as it did in South Australia and in Farah. But we may be in a very different position. We may be thinking about it very differently after those two elections when we see what their vote is, how they behave in the elections, how their preferences go, all that kind of stuff is going to become much clearer. Well, it's going to give us more evidence to work with this time next year, I think.
There's a lot of comparisons made between sort of Labor's, how they've benefited from Greens' preferences over the years when people on the right are talking about a potential deal, which is true, of course, but you don't see Labor kind of cozying up to the Greens between elections or talking about them like they're in some kind of alliance. In fact, they're pretty pugilistic towards the Greens. Anthony Albanese certainly is. So, there's a lot of difference between the approaches there, I think.
Yeah, it's like a coalition talking point. The Labor and the Greens are one party, but actually it's not true.
Yeah.
They don't, like you say, they don't behave like that in any way, in anything like the way that some people in the coalition are talking about it now.
Yeah, and many people think Anthony Albanese has often been harder on people in the Greens than he has been in the coalition. Just speaking of the government, it does look like they are also starting to take One Nation a bit more seriously, seeing them as a potential threat to their seats, not just to coalition seats. What do you make of the government strategy so far, Dan?
Yeah, I think there has been a shift over the past week, and I think prior to that, the question that a lot of Labor MPs were asking is, well, what is the strategy? It was clear that One Nation had eroded the coalition base, but it was eating up very quickly into Labor support as well. So I think if you look at Anthony Albanese's language over the past week, you can sort of look at it in three parts. He's now acknowledging openly the frustration that Australians are feeling. He's not denying that there is anger out there. He's tying it directly to the actions that the government is taking. So the budget, for instance, with the changes to negative gearing, capital gains tax and trusts was seen as a direct kind of policy response to address the sort of frustration and disillusionment that people have in the housing space. And then the third part of that strategy is kind of pointing out Pauline Hanson's record and drawing that kind of contradiction in her being the champion of the battlers, but at every point she's been asked to stand up for those working class people in Parliament, she's voted against wage rises and so on. So I think it's going to be, that third part is going to be a big focus of the government moving forward. Again, I had a conversation with Cos Samaras for a piece that's running on the weekend, asking him, what is the type of messaging that is going to resonate with what he calls Red One Nation, so those voters who are Labor that are moving. And he said that the kryptonite for Hanson is a 35-year-old nurse looking down the barrel of a screen, telling voters that One Nation is going to damage your pay. That is something that will really resonate with the types of voters that are vulnerable. We've already seen a little bit from Sally McManus, who's the head of the ACTU. So I think it's going to be something we see more and more of Labor is honing in on her record on wages. Now, whether it works, who knows? But I think that's going to be part of the strategy.
Peter Beattie, the former Queensland Premier, wrote for us recently and about how his government tried to counteract One Nation back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and after they'd been very successful in one Queensland election. And part of his point was you have to come up with a vision of the future. You have to give people something to look forward to, something credible that we can get to, maybe not in the span of this government or the next government, but this is what we're aiming for, this is what we're working towards. And I do think that's kind of missing a bit in some of the government's rhetoric, or at least people aren't buying it at the moment.
Yeah, and it presents a really fascinating challenge for the government. Is I don't think anyone thinks this atmosphere around politics is going to change anytime soon. I think One Nation is here for the foreseeable future. Labor has acknowledged the status quo is broken, more or less. Now, how far are they prepared to go in terms of essentially upending the system that they have been such a part of, along with the coalition, in sort of managing the Australian economy for decades? And I think obviously there was significant changes announced in the budget, but I think it's very clear, even a month out, that they're going to have to go much further in terms of both addressing the problems, whether it's in housing or other issues, but also sending that signal that you spoke about. And they do it in a kind of patchwork of ways. I think if you look at the bailouts that they've done for industries, whether it's in Gladstone or the steelworks in Whyalla, it's hugely expensive, and it's obviously about saving jobs, but it's also about sending signals that we're standing up for blue collar workers. And how far they're prepared to go, I think, is going to be one of the really significant narratives over the next couple of years.
I think the challenge for the government is, I think it would be a mistake to interpret all of One Nation's rise in support down to economic issues that people are feeling. So much of it is cultural identity issues as well. And I think that's going to be a much more challenging thing for the government to respond on. And I don't see how they're, really trying to counter that at the moment.
I just want to move on to the media coverage of One Nation, which I think we have seen a real shift in the last couple of weeks as well. So we're seeing a lot more scrutiny from some outlets, at least, of One Nation's policy platform. Several of their MPs really disassembled last week when pushed to explain their housing policy regarding foreign buyers. The SMH published a pretty scathing piece this week about the actual estimated cost of their defence policy. I'm curious whether the rest of you think this is actually likely to change the way some people who are thinking of voting One Nation may feel about the party, and does that matter?
It definitely matters what their policies are if they're leading in the polls. Whether they can plausibly become the next government or not, it still matters what they're proposing. And we should be studying it and are studying it. We've also done stories about their gas policy, looking quite in detail about their so-called Norway-style gas and resources tax policy. We've looked at their policy on abortion as well, which is something that might come increasingly prominent, I think. The media obviously should be doing that and increasingly are doing that, as you said. Whether that has any whether makes any difference to voters, I mean, it's not our role to influence voters, but whether the parties can use that kind of analysis of their policies to draw lessons that they can use to draw voters away from One Nation, I'm a bit sceptical, because I don't think people are looking at people who are saying they're going to vote for One Nation are not looking at their policies and not looking at them really as perhaps as a party of government at the moment. They just want to tear the whole thing down. That's the kind of mood, and doesn't matter to many people, except with one exception, I think, which is immigration, as Patrick mentioned. That's what people understand One Nation stand for, and there's a strong feeling in favour of that. But on detailed policies on other matters, I think yes, absolutely, they should be grilled on them. Will it make any difference in the short term, at least, on how people register their preferences? Whether people will say they'll vote for them or not, I very much doubt it.
I think it does make a difference, though, when your candidates can't explain the policy. Like, I think you don't want to...
to an election,
closer to an election, particularly, yeah. And, you can use history as a guide, like in 98, when they brought out their tax policy, One Nation's tax policy. They called Easy Tax, and it was supposed to be a simple 2% tax on each transaction. But under the slightest questioning by experienced journalists, they said, "Well, how would that work in a vertically integrated company?" And drilling down into the details, they didn't know, they hadn't thought it through, and it looks bad. And when somebody like Barnaby Joyce, who has decades of experience in politics, has done those interviews, an experienced interviewee, he can't explain the details. What's it going to be like when they get these, all these other candidates for other seats? It's not a good look. I think people clock it. I just remember that, James Diaz. Like, you'll have 100 of those type of car crash interviews. It just makes them look amateurish. I don't think it instills confidence in people. David Farley was a fairly experienced, good candidate, really, and he was able to put this case forward. They're not going to find another,
100 plus,
60, 100 plus David Farleys. So, I think it is a danger for One Nation.
What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, and I think, in Australia, there's time and time again, it's been proven that Australian voters are smart. And also and I don't say this is a bad thing, but they're selfish. Like, they look at what's offered up at an election by the major parties and say, well, who's going to give me the best for my personal circumstances? And I think when Hanson's policies do come under the scrutiny, again, in that campaign environment, I don't think we're going to see the scrutiny influence the polling or the way that she approaches these things outside of that environment. But once we're in the kind of campaign contest, both the media has honed in on the policies and also the electorate starts asking those questions, then I do think that there is going to be some challenges for her, and we're going to see the impact of that scrutiny and accountability journalism.
I think a good example is migration. So at the moment, One Nation has gone out talking about how they're going to cut migration, but they're not really being asked, what would that do to aged care? What would that mean for health and hospitals? I don't think the consequences...
I think they flagged some exceptions, but it's quite unclear how that would work. It's
unclear. So I think there is room for media and for voters to interrogate their policies more and ask, actually, what is the cost of all of this?
Yeah. All right, I think it's time for a quick break. But as always, drop us a line at fullstory@theguardian.com. We do want to hear from you. Not just if you have a question for us, but if you or someone you know is thinking about voting for One Nation, write in and tell us why. We'll be right back. And now it's time for what we can't get out of our head, which chatting before this show, it seemed like it was sort of only one story in town, which is the World Cup, which starts Australian time Friday morning. Dan, how are you feeling about it?
I'm very excited. There's a lot of World Cup fever in the Canberra Bureau at the moment. And what I was thinking of, and it sort of ties in a lot to the discussion we've had today about this debate that's happening in this country at the moment about immigration and what Australia looks like. What does modern Australia look like and what it should look like? And I think certainly among us sporting teams, there's probably no greater reflection of what modern Australia actually looks like than the Socceroos. And, wouldn't it be grand in the context of everything that's going on if the nation, albeit briefly, sort of rallied around a team led by Tony Popovich, Nestor Irankunda, Mo Toure, Jackson Irvine. It's a really wonderful part of our culture, and it's going to be great to celebrate that.
Mike, how's your football fever?
It's actually a bit damper than it sort of has been before some previous World Cups. I'm a little bit sort of daunted by the size of this one, which I hate. It's going to go forever, and much as I love football, I feel like I'm very alienated from the way FIFA operates, and obviously being in America at the moment, it's kind of tense. And I was particularly struck by the issue with the Somali referee who'd been picked, the first Somalian who had been picked to go to the finals, who was refused entry for the US on grounds of security, absurdly. And he was like given a hero's welcome back at the airport in Mogadishu, which is like, you don't often get that as a referee.
Yeah.
But it's pretty scant consolation for someone who would have been representing their country, albeit as an official at the World Cup. And just kind of, I don't know why that really affected me about my view about how I've seen the tournament, even though it's only one person. But yeah, it'll be great. It will be great. I completely endorse what Dan said about the Australian team. It would be fantastic if they do well. I'm not all that optimistic, but
If they
we'll
win
see.
a game.
Oh no, I mean, come on, there's certainly a possibility of that. But once it starts, I will definitely get into it in big time.
How are you feeling, Patrick?
Look, coming into it, I think, I had similar concerns to Mike about FIFA, and a lot of my friends have switched off. But look, it's hard to resist the pull of it. I ran the office sweepstake yesterday, and look, people were very excited by it. Even the people who drew Curacao or
New Zealand.
Cape Verde or New Zealand, they were all very keen.
The person who drew New Zealand was a New Zealander who instantly wanted to swap their team to someone else, which I
treasonous,
found disgraceful.
I got Croatia, so not too bad, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, I'm the ultimate fair weather football fan. I pay almost no attention to the Socceroos or the Boy Matildas, as a lot of people I know refer to them between World Cups, but I will be very excited come Sunday. I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining us again, Mike.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Joe.
And thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks, guys.